Under the blinding lights of the Hope for Pause broadcast, where the audience held their breath expecting violence from the feral German shepherd known as the Ghost, the animal suddenly froze. He didn't snarl. He didn't attack. Instead, he locked eyes with the ex-Navy SEAL standing 10 feet away and let out a strange, high-pitched hiccup of a whimper, a sound that belonged to a clumsy puppy, not a wild beast. Evan Stone stopped breathing. He knew that sound. He had memorized it 3 years ago, the night he left his dog Scout at a kennel that would burn to the ground days later. But Scout was dead. The police report said there were no survivors. So why was this scarred creature on live television looking at him with eyes that held a secret only the dead should know? Evan had survived war zones and ambushes long enough to bury his emotions behind a wall of steel, but in that studio, the wall was about to crumble. This story will restore your faith in miracles and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his dog. Subscribe now to witness a reunion that defied death itself. The studio air was sterile and frigid, smelling faintly of ozone and hairspray, a sharp contrast to the Los Angeles rain slicking the pavement outside. Inside the Hope for Pause set, artificial warmth beamed from blinding overhead rigs, masking the cold tension simmering below the polished floorboards. Evan drifted near the edge of the velvet ropes, a man carved from granite and regret standing awkwardly in a world of plastic smiles and rehearsed empathy. At 34, he carried the physical density of a former Navy SEAL, 6 feet 2 inches of coiled muscle that seemed too large for the casual button-down shirt the producers forced him to wear, preferring to hide his frame. His face was a map of hard living. A jagged, pale scar ran from his left temple into a beard that was kept short but thick, the color of dark walnut flecked with premature gray. His eyes, however, were the most arresting feature. Storm gray, constantly scanning the perimeter, never truly resting, always assessing threats that weren't there. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and somehow found more solace in beasts than in his own kind. To the audience, he was the stoic animal behavior expert, a quiet hero who saved dangerous dogs, but inside, Evan felt like a fraud, a hollow shell echoing with the ghosts of a jungle ambush that had taken everything from him. He adjusted his earpiece, the plastic digging into his skin, and tried to ignore the frantic energy of the floor director, a petite woman named Sarah with bright pink hair and a clipboard, who was currently shouting instructions about camera angles. Evan's hands, calloused and scarred from years of handling ropes and weapons, twitched at his sides, a nervous tic he couldn't suppress. The host, a polished man with teeth too white to be real and a suit that cost more than Evan's truck, announced the segment with practiced enthusiasm, his voice booming through the studio speakers. And now, for our special feature, we have a creature of mystery, a survivor from the rugged mountains of the Sierra Nevada. They call him the Ghost because for 3 years no human could get close to him. Evan stiffened, his jaw tightening under his beard. He hated the theatrics. To him, these animals weren't entertainment. They were broken souls, much like himself. He shifted his weight, his boots heavy on the polished floor, his mind briefly flashing back to the humid heat of a foreign deployment, the smell of cordite, and the feeling of a leash going slack in his hand. The memory of Bear. He pushed the thought away violently, locking it behind the steel door in his mind. That door had to stay closed if he wanted to function. Today was about this new dog, a feral German shepherd that had required a tranquilizer dart just to be transported here, a dog the shelter claimed was unadoptable. 2 handlers, wearing thick bite-proof gloves and looking visibly nervous, wheeled a large reinforced crate onto the center stage. The audience hushed, sensing the danger. The crate was scratched and dented, evidence of the panic inside, and a low, guttural growl vibrated from the mesh, causing the host to take a subtle step back. Evan stepped forward, his demeanor shifting instantly from awkward civilian to commanded authority. He signaled for silence with a sharp cut of his hand. "Open it slowly," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that the microphone barely caught, yet it carried the weight of absolute command. The metal latch clicked, a sound that seemed to slice through the studio's silence like a gunshot. The door swung open. Out stepped the ghost. He was magnificent and terrifying. A large male German shepherd with a coat the color of burnt sable and twilight, matted with mud and burrs. He was thin, his ribs showing through the fur, speaking of long winters and scarce meals. His movements were fluid but low to the ground, a predator expecting a fight. His ears, one slightly nicked at the tip, were pinned back against his skull, and his lips curled to reveal teeth bared in a silent snarl that warned of violence. The cameramen froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Evan prepared himself for a lunge. He planted his feet, shifting his center of gravity, ready to intercept the aggression, to become the target so the civilians wouldn't have to. But the lunge never came. As the dog's amber eyes swept across the blinding lights and the sea of strangers, they landed on Evan. The transformation was instantaneous and physically jarring. The snarl vanished. The hackles on the dog's back, which had been standing like razor wire, smoothed down. The creature froze, his nose twitching as he inhaled the scent of the man standing 10 feet away. A scent of old gunpowder, pine soap, and a sorrow that matched his own. Slowly, impossibly, the dog's ears lifted from their defensive pin, then flopped down to the sides in a gesture of absolute, puppy-like submission. The studio was so quiet you could hear the electric hum of the cameras. And then it happened. The dog didn't bark. He didn't growl. He tilted his massive head, looked directly into Evan's storm-gray eyes, and let out a sound that shattered the ex-soldier's world. It was a high-pitched, trembling whimper, a unique, broken sound, half cry and half hiccup. Evan felt his heart stop. The clipboard he had been holding slipped from his numb fingers, clattering loudly against the floor, but he didn't hear it. The world narrowed down to a single point, a tunnel vision focused solely on the animal before him. That wasn't just a dog sound. That was the specific, needy sound a puppy named Scout used to make years ago when he wanted to be held after a nightmare, a sound that Evan thought had been silenced by fire and time forever. The sound of that whimper did not just break the silence of the studio, it shattered the fragile glass floor of Evan's reality, sending him plummeting straight back into the hell he had spent 3 years trying to escape. The sterile scent of the television set vanished, replaced instantly by the suffocating stench of burning refuse, cordite, and the dry, metallic taste of fear that permeated the air of the Helmand province. The year was 2019. The heat was a physical weight pressing down on his chest, and he was no longer a broken civilian in a button-down shirt, but a hardened instrument of war, encased in Kevlar and ceramic plates. Beside him, moving with the silent, lethal grace of a shadow detached from its caster, was Bear. Bear was not just a dog, he was 85 pounds of disciplined fury and absolute loyalty, a Belgian Malinois-German shepherd mix with a coat like dark chocolate swirled with charcoal. He wore a tactical vest rigged with a camera and infrared strobe. His eyes, intelligent, amber, and infinitely older than his 4 years, scanning the horizon with a focus that shamed most human soldiers. Bear was the legend of their unit, the Fur Missile, who had found more IEDs than the minesweepers and saved more lives than the medics. To Evan, he was the other half of his soul, the only creature on Earth who understood the rhythm of his heartbeat in the dark. They were moving through a narrow alleyway in a hostile compound, the silence stretching tight enough to snap. The team was stacked behind them, but Evan and Bear were the tip of the spear. "Check it," Evan whispered, the comms in his ear hissing with static. He didn't need to speak loud. Bear understood hand signals and subtle body language better than verbal commands. The dog moved forward, sniffing the disturbed earth near a rusted metal door, his movements precise, almost balletic. Suddenly, Bear froze. It was the sit signal. the indicator of a trap. But something was wrong. The wind shifted and a door creaked open 50 yards ahead, revealing a silhouette raising an AK-47. In that split second, chaos erupted. The enemy wasn't just ahead, it was a baited ambush. As Evan raised his rifle to engage the shooter, he stepped forward, his boot hovering inches above a pressure plate concealed under a layer of deceptive dust. He hadn't seen it, but Bear had. The dog didn't bark. He didn't look for approval. He made the calculation that only a creature capable of unconditional love can make. Bear broke protocol. He abandoned the sit, launching himself not at the gunman, but sideways, throwing his entire body weight against Evan's shins. The force knocked Evan backward into the dirt, just as Bear's paws landed on the trigger mechanism intended for his handler. The explosion was a deafening roar that sucked the air out of the alleyway, a bloom of orange fire and black smoke that erased the world. Evan was thrown into a wall, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the shouting of his squad. When the dust settled, the silence was worse than the noise. Evan crawled through the debris, his vision blurring, screaming a name that would never answer again. Bear! Bear! He found him amidst the rubble. The tactical vest was shredded, the proud, powerful body broken. Bear was still breathing, shallow, ragged gasps that rattled in his chest. Evan ripped off his helmet, ignoring the blood dripping from his own nose, and cradled the dog's heavy head in his lap. Bear's amber eyes, glazing over, locked onto Evan's face. He didn't whimper in pain. He didn't struggle. He simply licked the tears mixing with the grime on Evan's cheek, a final gesture of comfort from a guardian who had completed his watch. "I'm sorry, buddy. I'm sorry. I ordered you there. It's my fault," Evan sobbed, the mantra of guilt that would carve itself into his DNA from that moment forward. Bear exhaled one last time, and the light in the amber eyes extinguished, taking Evan's purpose with it. The months that followed were a blur of disciplinary reviews, medical discharges, and a hollow emptiness that no amount of therapy could fill. Evan returned to the States a shell, carrying a survivor's guilt so heavy it made breathing a labor. He was discharged with honors he didn't want and a flag he couldn't look at. The only tether keeping him from drifting entirely into the abyss was a promise. Before that final deployment, Bear had sired a litter with a civilian breeder's shepherd. Evan went to the breeder's ranch, a quiet place in Montana, intending to say goodbye to the legacy. There, amidst a pile of yipping, tumbling puppies, was the runt. He was clumsy, with paws too big for his body and ears that hadn't quite decided to stand up yet. He didn't have Bear's intimidation. He was soft, goofy, and innocent. But when Evan sat down, weeping silently on the grass, the puppy waddled over, climbed into his lap, and curled up against the empty space in his chest. He looked up with eyes that held a spark of his father's amber fire and let out a soft, hiccuping whimper. Evan named him Scout. He wasn't a replacement. He was a penance and a salvation. "I couldn't save him," Evan whispered to the sleeping puppy that day, his thumb stroking the soft fur between Scout's ears. "But I swear on my life I will protect you. You will never know the fire. You will never know the pain. I've got you." That vow became the only law in Evan's life, a sacred contract written in the shadow of a tombstone he carried in his heart, until the fire at the kennel tore that promise apart too. The promise Evan made to the puppy had lasted exactly 4 months before the world demanded his service again. It wasn't a deployment to a combat zone this time, but a high-priority security consultation in Riyadh that the private military contractor firm insisted only he could handle. Evan had tried to refuse, his gut twisting with a familiar premonition of dread, but the contract was ironclad, and the money would finally pay off the mortgage on the secluded cabin where he planned to raise Scout in peace. Scout was 6 months old now, a lanky, awkward adolescent of a dog with ears that had finally stood up and a tail that acted like a metronome for his happiness. He was nothing like his father bear. Where Bear had been a disciplined weapon, Scout was a goofy, affectionate soul who tripped over his own paws and was terrified of thunderstorms. The day Evan had to leave, the sky was a bruised purple threatening rain. He drove Scout to the Sentinel's Rest, a high-end boarding facility specifically designed for the pets of deployed service members, located on the outskirts of the city near the dense tree line of the National Forest. The owner, Mrs. Gable, met them at the gate. She was a woman who looked like she belonged in a bakery rather than a kennel, short and stout with hair the color of spun sugar and a face etched with the deep, kind lines of someone who smiled often. She wore a floral apron over her sturdy work clothes and smelled faintly of lavender and dog biscuits. "We'll take good care of him, Sergeant," she had promised, her voice a soothing alto as she scratched Scout behind the ears. Scout leaned into her touch but kept his amber eyes fixed on Evan, sensing the goodbye. Evan knelt in the gravel, ignoring the ache in his knees, and unzipped his duffel bag. He pulled out an old, unwashed woodland camo field shirt, the one he'd worn during training exercises with Bear. It smelled of Evan, of sweat, and of the faint, lingering scent of gun oil. He tied it loosely around the metal bars of Scout's designated run. "You keep this safe for me, buddy," Evan whispered, pressing his forehead against the puppy's wet nose. Scout let out that signature sound, the high-pitched kee-heen whimper, and licked the salt from Evan's skin. Walking away from that kennel felt harder than walking into the ambush that had killed Bear. It felt like abandonment. 2 weeks into the assignment, the call came at 3:30 a.m. Riyadh time. The voice on the other end was the facility manager, choking back tears, but Evan didn't need to hear the words. The tone was enough to stop his blood cold. A massive electrical fault in the main heating system. It had happened in the dead of night. The suppression system had failed. By the time the fire trucks navigated the winding mountain roads, the main kennel block was an inferno. Evan was on a plane within 3 hours, leaving the contract, the money, and his career behind without a backward glance. The flight was a 14-hour hallucination of panic, where every time he closed his eyes, he saw smoke. When he finally arrived at the site, the Sentinel's Rest was gone. In its place was a blackened skeleton of timber and twisted metal, rising from the snow like the ribs of a leviathan. The smell was the worst part: wet ash, melted plastic, and the sickeningly sweet scent of tragedy. Evan stood at the police line, staring at the ruin, his body trembling with a rage that had nowhere to go. Chief Miller, the fire investigator, approached him slowly. Miller was a bear of a man himself, with a soot-streaked face and eyes that looked too tired to weep. He held a helmet under his arm, his heavy turnout gear stained with smoke. "I'm sorry, son," Miller said, his voice gravelly and low. "We did a grid search. We found remains of most, but the structure collapsed into the basement level where the pups were sleeping." Evan gripped the yellow tape until his knuckles turned white. "Did you find him? Did you find Scout?" Miller shook his head slowly, looking at the ground. "We didn't find a body for him specifically, no. But the heat in that quadrant. Nothing would have survived. There were no tracks leading out to the snow, and the perimeter fence was still locked. He's listed as missing, presumed deceased. I'm so sorry." Evan walked past him, ducking under the tape before the officer could stop him. He walked into the wreckage, his boots crunching on glass and charcoal. He found the spot where Run 4 had been. There was nothing left but twisted wire. He fell to his knees in the ash, frantically digging with his bare hands, looking for a collar, a bone, anything. He found a scrap of fabric, a tiny, charred corner of woodland camo cloth, fused to a piece of melted fencing. The shirt. Scout had stayed with the shirt. A primal scream tore from Evan's throat, a sound so raw and broken that the firefighters nearby turned away, unable to watch the private disintegration of a warrior. He had failed them both. He had let Bear die to save him, and he had left Scout to burn alone in the dark, waiting for a master who never came. That day, Evan didn't just leave the site, he left his life. He resigned his commission, sold the cabin, and retreated into a small apartment in the city, taking a job at the lowest rung of animal control, catching strays and cleaning cages. He punished himself with the filth and the danger of the job, becoming a ghost in his own life, seeking redemption in the eyes of every frightened animal he met, but never daring to love one again, until the day the cameras turned on. The whimper that escaped the throat of the ghost hung in the stagnant air of the studio like a suspended drop of water, defying gravity and logic, but the stillness that followed was shattered in a heartbeat. The lead handler, a burly man named Mike with forearms the size of tree trunks and a face constantly flushed with exertion, misread the situation entirely. He felt the tension coil in the animal's muscles and, assuming the dog was priming for an attack, jerked the heavy leather lead backward with a shout of, "Back! Stay back!" It was the wrong move. The dog, Scout, wasn't loading for a fight, he was loading for a reunion, and the restriction triggered a reaction that was pure kinetic instinct. With a snarl that was less aggression and more frustration, Scout twisted his massive neck, the muscles rippling under the matted sable fur like steel cables. He didn't bite the handler. He simply used his superior leverage and the sudden explosion of torque to rip the leather loop straight out of Mike's sweaty grip. The heavy brass clip swung free, clattering against the floor, and suddenly the dangerous feral beast was loose. Panic detonated in the studio. A woman in the front row screamed, a high, piercing sound that cut through the audio mix, and the audience scrambled backward, chairs scraping violently against the floor. Security guards stationed at the perimeter reached for their belts, their faces masks of professional alarm. "Cut the feed! Cut the feed!" Sarah, the floor director, shrieked into her headset, though the cameramen, paralyzed by the unfolding drama, kept the red lights burning. But Evan didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his arms in defense. He stood rooted to the spot, his gray eyes wide and brimming with a terrifying hope, watching the blurred shape of the German shepherd hurtle across the polished floor toward him. The dog's claws skittered on the slick surface, scrambling for traction, legs pumping with a desperation that overrode every survival instinct he had learned in the wild. To the audience, it looked like a predator closing in for the kill. To Evan, it looked like a missile returning to its silo. The impact was heavy and visceral. Scout didn't go for the throat or the legs. He launched himself into the air, all 80 pounds of him, slamming his front paws squarely onto Evan's chest, driving the air from the ex-soldier's lungs. It was a move that would have knocked a lesser man flat, a specific roughhousing greeting called the chest bump that Evan had taught a clumsy 6-month-old puppy in a backyard in Montana. Evan stumbled back a step, absorbing the weight, and then his knees simply gave way. He collapsed onto the studio floor, not from force, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that the laws of physics and death had just been rewritten. He was on his knees, and the dog was on top of him, but there were no teeth, no biting. Scout was frantic, making sounds that no wolf or wild dog would ever make, a symphony of yips, whines, and deep, vibrating groans of pure relief. He was washing Evan's face with a tongue that felt like sandpaper and salvation, knocking Evan's glasses askew, paws kneading Evan's shoulders as if trying to pull him closer than skin allowed. "Easy, easy," Evan choked out, his voice a broken ruin. His hands, shaking uncontrollably, moved instinctively to the dog's head, pushing through the filth and the mats to find the structure of the skull underneath. He needed proof. He needed to know this wasn't a hallucination born of 3 years of grief. His fingers traced the jawline, feeling the familiar ridge of bone, until his thumb brushed against a patch of scar tissue just under the chin. It was a small, jagged line shaped like a lightning bolt, a souvenir from the time a clumsy puppy had tried to chase a rabbit through a blackberry bramble and lost. The sensation of that scar against his thumb was an electric shock that stopped Evan's heart. The studio lights, the screaming audience, the shouting director, it all dissolved into white noise. Evan pulled back just an inch, framing the dog's face in his hands. The dog froze, panting, his amber eyes locked onto Evan's with an intensity that burned. "Scout?" Evan whispered, the name tearing out of his throat like a prayer he hadn't dared to speak since the fire. "Is that you, rookie?" The reaction was immediate and explosive. Hearing his old nickname, the one Evan used when Scout tripped over his own feet, the dog threw his head back and let out a bark that shook the rafters. It wasn't a warning bark. It was a joyous, booming declaration of identity. He dropped his head back onto Evan's shoulder, burying his nose in the crook of Evan's neck, inhaling the scent of the man he had crossed mountains to find. Evan buried his face in the dirty, matted fur, and for the first time since he watched the life leave Bear's eyes in the desert, he wept. He didn't just cry. He shattered. Great, heaving sobs racked his body, raw and ugly and loud, the sound of a dam breaking after years of holding back a flood. He wrapped his arms around the dog, rocking back and forth on the studio floor, oblivious to the cameras that were now zooming in, capturing the rawest moment of human emotion ever broadcast on the network. The audience's panic morphed into a stunned, tearful silence. Handlers lowered their catch poles. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, signaling the cameramen to keep rolling. This wasn't a mauling. This was a resurrection. The collective sob that had swept through the studio began to subside, replaced by a reverent, heavy silence as the audience watched the reunion between the broken soldier and the miracle dog. Evan remained on the floor, his face buried in Scout's neck, breathing in the scent of pine pitch, old rain, and the unmistakable musk of survival that clung to the animal's coat. The host, realizing that his practiced patter was useless in the face of such raw authenticity, stepped back, signaling to the wings. From the shadows emerged a man who looked entirely out of place amidst the high-definition gloss of Hollywood. Ranger Elias Thorne was a man carved from the very landscape Scout had inhabited. He was in his late 50s, with a face weathered into deep canyons by high-altitude sun and biting winds. He wore the olive-drab uniform of the National Forest Service, not as a costume, but as a second skin, stained with oil and earth. His hair was a shock of iron gray, swept back from a forehead etched with worry, and his eyes were the color of moss, kind but piercingly observant. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his right leg, carrying a clear plastic evidence bag in one hand and a remote clicker in the other. Thorne didn't play to the cameras. He walked straight to where Evan knelt and placed a heavy, reassuring hand on the younger man's trembling shoulder. "We called him the Ghost because we couldn't catch him," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble that sounded like gravel shifting under boots, magnified by the boom mic hovering overhead. "But we were wrong. He wasn't hiding. He was on patrol." Thorne turned to the large LED screen behind them, clicking the remote. A map of the western United States appeared, dotted with hundreds of red markers forming a chaotic yet distinct trajectory leading away from the site of the Kennel Fire in Montana, winding south through the brutal terrain of the Rockies and into the Sierra Nevadas. "We've been tracking this dog for 3 years," Thorne addressed the audience, though his eyes kept flickering back to Scout. "After the fire at Sentinel's Rest, investigators assumed all the animals perished. But the forensics team found one kennel door, Run 4, that hadn't been melted shut. The latch was intricate, a double-gravity slide bolt designed to be escape-proof. But it had been manipulated from the inside. There were teeth marks on the steel slide." Evan looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and wide. He remembered the long afternoons in his backyard, teaching a clumsy 6-month-old Scout how to open the garden gate, a trick that was meant to be a game to build the puppy's confidence. "He opened it," Evan whispered, his voice cracking. "I taught him how to work a slide bolt. I thought it was just a game." "It saved his life," Thorne confirmed solemnly. He waited until the smoke was low, popped the latch, and ran before the roof collapsed. "But here's the part that defies biology." Thorne clicked the remote. Again, and the map zoomed in on the red clusters. "Most stray dogs stay near towns, scavenging trash. Scout didn't. Look at where he went." The red dots clustered around very specific locations: the perimeter of Malmstrom Air Force Base, the abandoned training grounds near Fort Harrison, and the remote fencing of the Mountain Warfare Training Center in California. He traveled over 800 miles on foot. He wasn't looking for food. He was visiting military installations. He was looking for uniforms. He was looking for the specific scent of gun oil, canvas, and the rhythm of boots hitting the ground. He was hunting for you, son. The realization hit Evan like a physical blow. Scout hadn't just run away from the fire. He had embarked on a 3-year deployment, a solo mission across a hostile continent to find the only pack leader he had ever known. Thorne knelt down, bringing his face level with the dog. Scout, still pressed against Evan, gave a low woof of recognition toward the ranger who had finally managed to trap him. "And he didn't do it alone," Thorne said softly, lifting the plastic evidence bag he had carried on stage. "When we finally tranquilized him in the foothills 2 days ago, he was wearing this. It was wrapped so tight around his neck we had to cut it off to check for infection. It wasn't a collar. It was this." Thorne opened the bag and pulled out a ring of fabric. It was blackened, stiff with grime and dried sap, and frayed to the point of disintegration. But as the studio lights hit it, the pattern was unmistakable. A strip of woodland camouflage, charred at the edges. It was the remains of the field shirt Evan had tied to the kennel bars. Scout hadn't just escaped. He had gone back into the inferno to retrieve the one thing that smelled like Evan. He had carried it, likely in his mouth for miles until it knotted, or perhaps he had pushed his head through the loop to keep it safe, wearing it like a talisman against the cold nights. "He wore your scent like armor," Thorne said, his voice thickening with emotion. Evan reached out, his trembling fingers brushing the charred fabric. It was a tangible testament to a loyalty that transcended species, a loyalty that had walked through fire and crossed mountain ranges just to say, "I am still here. I am still yours." The silence in the studio had shifted from stunned shock to a reverent hush, the kind usually reserved for cathedrals or monuments. But Ranger Elias Thorne wasn't finished. He stood with his hand resting heavily on the podium, his moss-green eyes scanning the audience before settling back on Evan, who was still on the floor, his fingers tangled in the ruff of the dog who had returned from the dead. Thorne signaled the production booth, his voice dropping an octave, becoming grave and thick with a suppressed emotion that made the air in the room feel heavy. "There is one final piece to this puzzle," Thorne said, his gravelly voice echoing slightly. "We didn't just find Scout wandering the woods. We didn't catch him because he made a mistake. We caught him because he wanted to be found. He flagged us down." Evan looked up, confusion warring with the relief in his tear-streaked face. Scout, sensing the shift in his master's mood, pressed his wet nose against Evan's neck, letting out a low, vibrating hum of reassurance. Thorne pressed the remote again. The large LED screen behind them flickered, transitioning from the map of the dog's journey to high-definition aerial footage, the timestamp in the corner reading just 48 hours prior. The video was shaky at first, the perspective of a search-and-rescue drone battling high-altitude crosswinds. Below, the landscape was a brutal tapestry of jagged granite and deep, shadowed ravines dusted with early frost, terrain that would kill an unprepared human in a single night. The camera panned over a cluster of boulders near a dry creek bed, the thermal imaging overlay switching to optical zoom as it locked onto a heat signature. There, nestled into a crevice that offered meager shelter from the biting wind, was a splash of bright, unnatural color, a red puffer jacket, and wrapped entirely around that small patch of red was a large, dark shape. 3 days ago, a 5-year-old boy named Leo went missing from the Whispering Pines campground, 10 miles from where we picked up Scout's trail, Thorne narrated, his eyes never leaving the screen. The parents were frantic. The temperatures dropped below freezing that night. We had helicopters, dogs, volunteers on foot. We found nothing, until the drone pilot saw this. On the screen, the dark shape moved. It was Scout, He wasn't sleeping, he was on watch. As the drone buzzed lower, the dog lifted his massive head, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood up, placing his body deliberately between the child and the open exposure of the ravine, and looked straight into the camera lens. The footage zoomed in, grainy but unmistakable. The boy, Leo, was curled in the fetal position, his small hands clutching the thick fur of the wild dog's flank. He was asleep, or unconscious from exhaustion, but he was alive. Scout, ribs showing through his matted coat, looked emaciated, a creature running on fumes and willpower. Yet, when the drone hovered, Scout threw his head back and barked, a rhythmic, deep, booming cadence that Evan recognized instantly. It wasn't the frantic yapping of a scared animal, it was the alert signal. Bark. Pause, bark, pause. It was the signal military working dogs used to guide handlers to a target. Evan's breath hitched in his throat, a fresh wave of tears blurring his vision. He had never taught Scout that signal. That was Bear's signal. That was the sound Bear had made in the ruins of Kandahar to lead medics to wounded soldiers. It was genetic memory, a ghost in the blood, manifesting in a dog who had never seen a battlefield but carried the heart of a warrior. He stayed with the boy for 2 days, Thorne continued, his voice cracking slightly. He kept him warm. He kept the coyotes away. And when he heard our drone, he didn't run to save himself. He signaled us. He gave up his freedom to save that child. The video cut to the moment the ground team arrived. The camera shook as a rescuer with a helmet cam slid down the scree. The boy, Leo, a small pale child with a mop of curly brown hair and tear tracks cutting through the dirt on his cheeks, woke up as the flashlights hit him. He didn't cry for his mother first. He reached for the dog. "Puppy stayed," the boy whispered in the audio recording, his voice raspy. "The monster tried to come, but Puppy scared it away. The monster was likely a mountain lion or a bear, predators that roamed those ridges." Scout, in the video, didn't snap at the rescuers. He simply stepped back, his job done, and collapsed into the snow, his energy spent. Back in the studio, the audience was openly weeping. Evan stared at the screen, then down at the dog in his arms. He saw the lineage now, undeniable and overwhelming. Scout wasn't just a goofy pet he had tried to protect from the world. He was Bear's son. He had inherited the courage, the instinct to protect the vulnerable, the refusal to leave a man, or a boy, behind. Evan had spent 3 years thinking he had failed Bear by letting his legacy die in a fire. But looking at the footage of Scout shielding that child, Evan realized the truth. The legacy hadn't died. It had just gone on a secret mission. "You did good, Scout," Evan whispered, burying his face in the dog's neck, his voice fierce with pride. "You did so good. Papa would be so proud of you." Scout let out a soft huff of breath and rested his chin on Evan's shoulder, closing his eyes as if to say, "Mission accomplished." "I'm off the clock." The red tally light on camera 1 finally blinked off, plunging the studio into a twilight of dim safety lights and hushed conversations. But for Evan, the real world was just coming back into focus. The chaos of the broadcast, the viral fame that was already exploding across social media platforms, and the flurry of producers trying to book follow-up interviews, it all dissolved into white noise. The only reality that mattered was the warm, solid weight of Scout leaning against his leg and the wet nose nudging his palm every few seconds, a constant, rhythmic check-in that grounded Evan in the present. There was no bureaucratic red tape to navigate regarding the adoption. The moment Ranger Thorne had handed over the leash, the legalities became irrelevant in the face of moral certainty. Scout wasn't a pet to be adopted. He was a partner who had returned from a long deployment. 6 months later, the smog of Los Angeles was a distant memory, replaced by the crisp, pine-scented air of the Montana foothills, a landscape that mirrored the rugged topography of Evan's own healing soul. With the help of donations that had poured in from viewers touched by the ghost dog story, Evan hadn't just bought a house, he had built a sanctuary. A wooden sign hung over the main gate, hand-carved from reclaimed cedar, bearing the name Bear's Legacy, K9, Rehabilitation and Reintegration. The facility was a sprawling ranch designed not as a kennel, but as a bridge between trauma and peace. It was here that Evan found his new mission. He took in the unadoptables, dogs found in war zones, survivors of abuse, and high-drive working breeds that couldn't adjust to suburban life, and gave them a purpose. But the dogs were only half of the equation. On a crisp Tuesday afternoon, a dusty pickup truck crunched up the gravel driveway carrying the program's newest applicant. Marcus was a 24-year-old former Marine combat engineer, a young man who looked like he was vibrating with an internal frequency of terror. He was thin, his clothes hanging loosely on a frame that had forgotten how to relax, with knuckles tattooed with faded ink and eyes that darted around the property like a trapped bird seeking an exit. He had lost his lower left leg to an IED in Syria, but the prosthetic wasn't what made him stumble. It was the weight of the invisible things he carried. Evan walked out to meet him, not with a clipboard or a handshake, but with Scout at his heel. Scout was different now. The matted ghost was gone, replaced by 85 pounds of sleek, muscle-bound vitality, his sable coat gleaming like obsidian in the sun. He sat instantly when Evan stopped, his amber eyes calm and assessing. I don't know if I can do this," Marcus stammered, his hands shaking as he reached for a pack of cigarettes he was trying to quit. "I'm not good with people, or loud noises, or anything, really." "Good thing he's not people," Evan said softly, his voice carrying the rough, comforting timbre of someone who had stood in that exact same darkness. He gestured to Scout. "This is Scout. He walked 800 miles through snow and fire because he refused to give up on a memory. He's got scars under that fur that would make yours look like paper cuts. He knows what it's like to be the only thing left alive in the smoke." Evan gave a subtle hand signal. Scout broke his sit and walked slowly toward the young Marine. He didn't jump. He didn't bark. He moved with a deliberate, heavy grace, closing the distance until he was pressing his shoulder firmly against Marcus's good leg. It was a grounding technique, a physical anchor for a drifting mind. Marcus froze, his breath hitching. Scout looked up, locked eyes with the trembling young man, and let out a soft, low exhale. Not a whimper this time, but a sigh of shared understanding. Slowly, Marcus's hand unclenched. His fingers buried themselves in Scout's fur. The shaking in his shoulders stopped. For the first time in months, the young Marine took a full, deep breath. Watching them, Evan felt the last heavy chain of guilt around his own heart snap and fall away. This was the mission. This was the why. That evening, as the sun began to bleed purple and gold behind the jagged silhouette of the Rockies, Evan sat on the steps of his porch, a cold beer sweating in his hand. The ranch was quiet, save for the chorus of crickets and the distant call of a hawk. Scout lay beside him, his head resting heavily on Evan's thigh, his eyes half closed in contentment. Evan looked out over the land, at the training agility course, the small cabins for visiting veterans, and the flag snapping gently in the breeze. For 3 years he had been haunted by the image of Bear dying in the dirt, consumed by the belief that his order had destroyed the best thing he ever knew. He had punished himself, believing he deserved to be alone. But as he stroked the lightning bolt scar under Scout's chin, he finally understood the truth. Bear hadn't just died to save Evan's life in that alleyway, he had died to ensure Evan could eventually build this. Bear had passed the torch to his son, entrusting the clumsy, goofy puppy with the gravest mission of all, to save the handler that Bear could no longer protect. "You knew, didn't you, buddy?" Evan whispered into the twilight, speaking to the empty air where he used to see ghosts. "You knew he could do it." Scout's ear twitched at the sound of Evan's voice, and he thumped his tail once against the wooden deck, a solid, rhythmic sound of life. Evan took a sip of his beer, the bitterness pleasant on his tongue. The grief was still there, but it was no longer a jagged stone in his boot. It was just a quiet shadow, a reminder of the price of love. He looked down at the dog who had crossed a continent to find him. "We're okay now, Bear," Evan said, closing his eyes and feeling the peace settle over him like a warm blanket. "We've got the watch from here." Scout let out a long, contented breath, closed his amber eyes, and drifted into a dreamless sleep, safe at last in the arms of the soldier who had finally come home. The story of Evan and Scout is a powerful reminder that love is never truly lost, only waiting to be found again. It serves as a testament to the idea that miracles are real, and that God often works through the most innocent among us to heal our deepest wounds. Scout's journey across hundreds of miles was not merely instinct, but a divine intervention, a proof that even in the ashes of our past, hope can rise again. In your own life, when the silence feels overwhelming, remember that you are never walking alone and that redemption often arrives in unexpected forms. If this story of faith and reunion touched your soul, please consider sharing it with a friend, leaving a comment to share your thoughts, and subscribing to our channel for more inspiring tales. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your life with His enduring peace.